Hello there, this is Instructor Paul, and in this lecture, we're going to promote our new ITFDC02 server as a domain controller on our itflee.com domain. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of the server under Server Manager. I'm going to click on Local Server, and we can see the computer has been renamed to ITFDC02, and I have the Ethernet IP address configured to 192.168.0.11. One last check we could do is to ping the primary domain controller. By hitting the start button in the bottom left, we're going to type in CMD and we'll open command prompt. Once command prompt comes up, we're going to type in the command ping 192.168.0.10. Okay, and I can see that I'm getting a response. And the reason why I'm able to get a response is because I've either, one, dropped the firewall on our domain controller, or I've allowed ping requests to come through on the Windows firewall of the computer that has 192.168.0.10, which is ITFDC01. So pings, even if you're connected, if the firewall has not been configured, if you've not gone in and configured your firewall to allow ping requests, they by default will time out. Okay, so a timeout on this ping does not necessarily mean you're not connected, but if you do get a ping to go through and you get a reply, that does mean that you are connected to the domain controller. Okay, and then like I said, if you're having issues with that, just drop the firewall on the domain controller or allow ICMP requests to go through. All right, the next thing we're going to do is close out of command prompt, and we're going to go to manage in the top right corner, and we're going to select add roles and features. And this process is going to be very similar to when we first built our original domain controller. So we have this before you begin. We're going to skip through this message. The installation type is going to be a role-based or feature-based installation. We'll click next. And of course, we'll only have the one server, ITFDC02. We will click next. And now we need to choose the server roles. And we're going to go for Active Directory Domain Services. So far, this is exactly the same as when we built our first domain controller. So we're going to click Add Features because we're going to need all of these required Active Directory Domain Services features. We see the Active Directory and the AD LDS tools, the Active Directory Domain Services tools. So we'll just click Add Features, and then we're going to click Next again. Now we don't need any additional features, so we'll just click Next. And again, this is a window talking about Active Directory Domain Services, just talking about what it does. We're going to click Next, and then we will click Install. Okay, so now we're just going to hold on for a second and wait for this installation to complete. So just go ahead and pause your video and come back once your installation is complete. Okay, so the installation has finished. So now we're going to click Close. And up here in the top right corner, we're going to see that we have some notifications. So if we click on this, we need to complete the post-deployment configuration. So we'll click Promote this server to a domain controller. And again, these are the exact same steps we followed for the first domain controller that we built, except now things are going to get a little bit different. So before, if you remember, we chose Add a New Forest, and we typed in itflee.com, and that built our new domain. But this time, what we want to do is add a domain controller to an existing domain. So the domain that we're adding to is itflee.com. And now we need to specify the credentials we're going to use for this operation. Now, you'll remember the domain controller is not joined to the domain at all. So what we're essentially doing is joining the server to the domain and then making it a domain controller. All right, so I'm going to click Change here. Okay, so now we need to type in the user account that we're going to use, and I'm going to use administrator. And we'll notice here it says domain ITFDC02. That's not a valid domain for itflee.com. So we need to specify the itflee.com domain. So we can just do that by typing the @ and saying itflee.com. Okay, and now we're going to type in our password. Hopefully I got that right. And we can also specify the domain by typing in itflee and then / administrator if we would like to do it that way. It doesn't really matter. Okay, now I'll click OK. And now what we're going to do is click Next. And now on this screen, we need to specify the domain controller capabilities and site information. So these default options here is the domain naming system. We can make it the global catalog or a read-only domain controller. First, what you need to understand is that we don't have to make this new domain controller a DNS server. That's optional. But the whole reason for adding a second domain controller is redundancy. So if our first domain controller goes down, We don't want that to be our only domain naming system or DNS server on our network. So I'm going to make this also a DNS server. Same thing for the global catalog. I'll leave that box checked. Now, making it a read-only domain controller would make this domain controller where I didn't write changes to Active Directory. It's essentially just a copy that is updated but does not hand out updates. I'm not going to choose this option because I don't want ITFDC02 to be a read-only domain controller. I want it to be able to make changes. Okay, so site name, we can just leave that at default first site name. And now we need to create, just like we did before, the DSRM password. And I'm going to do that now. And if you remember, we did this when we built our first domain controller. This is if we have to restore the directory services, or if we had to enter directory services restore mode. So now that I've typed in both those passwords, I'm going to click next. And we have this message: a delegation for the DNS server cannot be created because there's no authoritative parent zone. That's because itflea.com, we're not putting that domain out on the internet. That's going to be fine. We're just going to click next and ignore that message. Okay, so now we need to choose where we want to replicate the Active Directory database or information from. So we can choose a specific domain controller. We only have the other single domain controller, ITFDC01. I'm just going to leave it at any domain controller. And we could also do this from, a hard drive or a CD or an ISO if we wanted to. But we haven't created that. You have to do that ahead of time. And that would there's rare cases where you need to do it from, a hard drive instead of a domain controller that's actually on the internet or on the network. So I'm just going to leave this as the default options and I'm going to click next. Again, we can specify the ADDS database log files and sysvol locations. These are all going to be perfectly fine at the default locations. So we'll click next. And if we wanted to use a script, we could do this by hitting view script and then copying. This is a Windows PowerShell script that we could just run on any domain controller that we build, or any Windows Server operating system that we install. We could run this script on it and it would promote it as a domain controller. All right, but we're not going to do that. We're just going to click next. And now it's going to run through another prerequisite check. And we're just going to wait for this to finish and then we'll come back once it's done. Okay, so now we have the prerequisite check and we have Windows Server 2016 domain controllers have a default security setting. These are things that we can change if we wanted to, but I'm not too worried about it because it's my lab, but it's just saying that we have some vulnerabilities that we need to address. And then it's saying, refer to this article located at this link to see how to fix it. And then again, the DNS delegation, because we're not promoting this to the internet, it's not going to be on itflea.com, the actual website. So what we're going to do, it says prerequisite checks and all prerequisite checks pass successfully. So now we just need to click install to begin. So I'm going to click the install button. And now we're just going to have to wait just a few minutes. So pause your video and come back once your installation is complete. Okay, so we can see the domain controller is about to be restarted. I'll just click the close button. And again, we will click close. Okay, so now we just need to hold on for a second and the server is going to reboot. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and log into our domain controller now. Okay, so what we're going to do now that we've logged into our new domain controller is just click on the local server here. And then we're going to see that the domain is itflea.com. And so now what we can do is hit Tools and open Active Directory Users and Computers. And we can now see that this server is joined to the Active Directory domain of itflea.com. And if we click on domain controllers, now we see ITFDC01 and ITFDC02. So that is how you add a domain controller to an existing domain. So great job getting through this lecture. I'm looking forward to seeing you in the next one.